scenario analysis. Today we're going to talk about planning the future. And in the words of rock and roll legend Jim Steinman, there's nothing so sad as tomorrow gone bad. The future ain't what it used to be. Well, we're going to talk about a future gone bad. If we look at the strategy matrix, we see that strategic workforce planning is all about the quantity and the quality of the workforce. It's not only about the quantity and quality today, but it's also about the quantity and quality tomorrow. And that's what scenario analysis is all about. And when we talk about scenario analysis or scenario planning, we're talking about the ID principle. And the ID principle means it depends. So when we talk about the future in terms of scenario planning, the only thing we know for sure is it depends. It might be, it might not be. Now the funny thing is, when we talk about determining strategy, we're taking an internal look and saying, hey, what are our organizational capabilities and how can we leverage them in order to create an organizational strategy? So in the SWOT analysis, you start with your strengths and weaknesses, your internal capabilities and non-capabilities, and then you look outside to the opportunities and the threats in the external environment. Now for scenario analysis, this model turns upside down. When you engage in scenario planning and scenario analysis, you're going to start at the external environment. You're going to start at the threats and the opportunities, and then you're going to see, hey, how can I adapt my organization in a way that it will divert the threats in the external environment and that it can seize the opportunities in the external environment. So that's what scenario planning is all about. It starts looking outside in the external environment, and then it looks inside. How can we change our operations in a way to benefit most from the opportunities and to avoid the threats in the external environment? As we just saw, scenario planning takes an outside-in perspective. It starts at the threats, then looks at the opportunities, then the weaknesses, and then the strengths. It's important to know and to keep in mind that the future is not predictable, but it is imaginable. For example, if you buy a specific new car, you see that car driving on the road way more frequent. Why? Not because there's more of those cars on the road, no, because you're open to it, you're open to perceiving them. And it's the same with scenario planning. When you imagine a future, you're able to recognize it earlier. And when we talk about scenario planning, one of the key people to mention is Peter Schwartz, and he worked at Shell. And in the 70s, he developed a model for, hey, what would happen if the oil prices would crash. And he and his team developed a number of contingencies that helped them recognize the scenario when it happened, the oil crisis in the 70s. And they already had a number of contingencies ready that helped Shell to gain a competitive edge during the crisis and come out rather unscathed. So scenario planning is all about identifying and qualifying external factors and their uncertainty. It's important to keep in mind scenario planning will not reduce uncertainty, but it will identify it and it will help you visualize it. And in the words of Peter Schwartz, I'll include a video of him in the course material, if you haven't thought about it, you're unlikely to see it in time. So in the next 10 or 15 minutes, I'll take you through a scenario planning exercise. I don't want you to start planning scenarios for your own organization. See this as an exercise with 7 steps that you can do with a team. Put a number of people together and say, hey, today we're going to engage in scenario planning and we're going to imagine the future. And the purpose of this exercise is to give you the basic tools needed to engage in scenario planning. And scenario planning is very, very complicated. What you can do is create, for example, a day or half a day where you sit together with a number of peers and say, hey, let's do a scenario planning exercise. By going through the 7 steps that I'll show you in the next slides, you can guide that group and together you can engage in scenario planning. And usually what will happen with multiple people, you can create way better scenarios. So doing this exercise can take 4 hours and it can take up to 8 hours, and depending on the level of detail of the different scenarios, you can specify it and you can make it your full-time job even. But I'll give you the guidelines that will help you take others through the 7 steps of scenario planning. And I'll give you a few examples while doing it. Scenario planning in 7 steps. I'll walk you through the 7 steps and then I'll show you how to apply them individually. In the first step, you will identify the internal issues of concern for the workforce. In the second step, you'll identify the key factors in the local environment that will influence success and failure in the first step. In the third step, you'll identify the driving forces in the external environment, so the outside-in look, that will influence the local factors in step 2. So how will the external environment impact how we are running the business and the success and the key factors in our business? In the fourth step, you will order the driving forces based on their impact and their uncertainty. Then in the fifth step, you'll classify a number of scenarios by choosing the most important and the most impactful driving forces. Based on that, you'll create a story for the different scenarios that you've planned. And in the last step, you're going to think about the implications of the different scenarios. And that's a step that you can spend a day on and you can spend months on it. I'll take you through the 7 different steps. First of all, and as I said, I will do this exercise in a group. Take each of you a piece of paper and identify the internal issues of concern for the workforce. Answer the questions: what is keeping you and the other decision makers awake at night? And focus predominantly on the factors that relate to the workforce, because we're engaging in strategic workforce planning and scenario planning around the workforce. What factors about the workforce are keeping you and other decision makers awake at night? Write those factors down and make a list, and don't be afraid to have too many options. Especially in the first 4 steps, it's important to get a lot of options on paper. The second step is to identify the key factors in the local environment that will identify the success and failure of the key factors that keep you awake at night. So how is the local environment exerting influence on those factors? And think about stakeholders, customers, for example, their wishes, their complaints. What do the customers want to see? What do the customers like? Suppliers, employees, unions, the managing board, etc., etc., etc. Define those important groups in your local environment, and for each group, go over each of the points you wrote down in step 1, categorize by those groups, and define the key factors that will influence the success and the failure of those factors you mentioned. So your list in step 1 will be longer in step 2. In step 3, you identify the driving forces in the external environment that will influence the local factors in step 2 and order them by dimension. Say, hey, what are the societal forces, the technological forces, so this is all external forces, forces from the economy, ecology, for example, political, etc. And all these variables should be, in the first place, external, and in the second place, linked with your workforce. And don't be afraid if you come up with a list of 20, 30, maybe even 50 or 60 variables. That's good. Especially for the step 2 and step 3, you can take half an hour or maybe even an hour per step. Don't be afraid to spend a lot of time on it. Let me give you an example of a gaming company I worked with. The board of directors was really concerned about the innovativeness of gaming consoles. The previous release of gaming consoles weren't really that much better. The graphic cards in those consoles weren't much improved. Also the RAM was quite steady. And that meant that future games didn't necessarily need to have the highest technological specs, because there was just not enough RAM and not enough graphical memory in those video cards and on those consoles to process newer and much fancier graphics. That had everything to do with what kind of people, what kind of developers, what kind of engineers do I hire as a company. When we go to step 2, innovation in consoles had an impact on their employees and on their customers, because the customers' wishes were, hey, I want to have games that look good, but that also play well with 60 frames per second on my console. So the customers were an important factor in the local environment, but also the employees. The employees wanted to make new stuff, wanted to innovate, wanted to stick with the company, but only stuck with the company if they were really a leader. They were a producer of high quality games. So they had a number of key factors in the local environment that kept the board of directors awake at night. So what are the driving forces in the external environment that will influence the local factors? And when you look at technology, one of the external variables and a variable that's linked to the workforce was, hey, how innovative are these gaming consoles really going to be? Will there be a lot of innovation, and will the next generation of gaming consoles be really highly spec'd? And do we need to keep innovating and keep doing our R&D in order to keep up with our competition? Or do we need to really focus on efficiency and create better graphics in the current constraints of RAM and of graphical processing power? Those were the issues that they were, in this case, technological issues that this company was facing. Now in step 4, you're going to qualify those issues and give them a certain rating. And you give them a rating on impact and on uncertainty. And you see this specific driving force, innovation in a traditional gaming console, it's in the technology dimension, and it has a high impact and it has a high uncertainty. And uncertainty in this case is not about how uncertain is his trend. No, it is about how uncertain are we in our estimation of the actual value of this factor. If you think a value has a high impact but also a high uncertainty, it can both have a tremendous impact, but it can also have a much smaller impact than you would expect. So that's what uncertainty is all about. And these were a few of the driving forces for this specific gaming company. Now this list shows you all the driving forces and the ones which can create the most devastation or have the highest opportunity for your organization. So what you want to do, you want to select the ones, or especially look at the ones with the highest impact and the highest uncertainty. Why? Because their impact will be huge and the estimation of the actual value is also very uncertain. So these factors are the biggest threats or opportunities for your organization. Now what you do next is you plot them in a 3x3. You plot them by the level of impact and the level of uncertainty. So competition from indie game developers has a low impact and a low level of uncertainty. Virtual reality applications have a high uncertainty and an estimated low level of impact. But you see that innovation in gaming consoles has a high level of impact for this company and a high level of uncertainty. And the same goes for regulation. Now, these two factors with high uncertainty and high impact, those are drivers. They are the ones that you really need to watch out for and think about in your scenario planning. Now, the ones with a lower level of uncertainty but still a high level of impact, they are the other factors of influence, OFI. And these other factors of influence, you don't directly involve them in the scenarios that you're going to create, but you need to keep them in the back of your mind. So write them down and remember them. They're the other factors of influence. In the next step, you're going to take your two most important drivers and you're going to plot them on a 2x2. So you say, hey, the innovation in consoles can be high and can be low. Remember, it has a high impact and a high uncertainty, so it can go both ways. And the other driver is the level of regulation, which can be high and which can be low. And now you have a map where you have 4 different scenarios with, for example, low levels of regulation and a high innovation in consoles, a high level of regulation, a high level of innovation in consoles, etc. You have 4 different scenarios. What you now want to do in the 6th step, and you can take your sweet time for this, is to give each scenario a name. And then make a description of each scenario. For example, with low levels of regulation and high levels of innovation in consoles, you say, hey, no regulation in the video game industry, innovation of consoles requires frequent updates of existing games and regular new releases. This involves high production costs and high R&D expenses. As you can imagine, when there's a high level of innovation in consoles, you need to stay on top of your game, you need to bring up the nicest and the best looking graphics, you need to make good quality games which are relatively low demand on the processor. You want to stay on top of your game, so to say. If you have a low level of innovation in consoles and a low level of regulation, you need to really optimize the graphics that you can bring on the current settings of the consoles. So new updates are more focused on monetizing the current user base, and you have a lower innovation and R&D in terms of new technologies, but you do want to optimize the graphics that you can show while using less memory and less graphical memory in your games. Well, a similar thing is a high level of regulation on violent video games and a high level of innovation in consoles requires game developers to censor, that's the right top corner, to censor current games and release new content more frequently. Higher maintenance and higher in cost threatens the industry. This is a scenario where you need to work with specialists to keep innovating and keep updating the specs of the games that you're releasing. Well, if you have low innovation in consoles and a high level of regulation, you need to make changes in your current offering, especially if you make violent video games for this company. Traditional approaches to building video games suffice and create a competitive advantage because of low innovation. Give those 4 scenarios names and write about what will happen in those scenarios, because as they will occur, they'll have an impact on how the business is run. And you can again take your time for this step. This can take you an hour, maybe a few hours even, to complete, to discuss in groups, and to come to an agreement. And then in the 7th step, you're going to think about the implications of the different scenarios. How will these 4 scenarios impact the focus issues that you listed in step 1? What opportunities and threats can be identified? And how will it impact the workforce? For example, we saw different scenarios in innovation that requires a different kind of developer for your workforce. And what actions can be taken to accommodate this scenario? So when the scenario occurs, you already have an action plan and you're ready to make the adaptations to your workforce, and you have the personnel, the key personnel, to execute. This is in 7 steps how you create and plan scenarios. And what I would advise you to do is to read it through and to apply it, and that would be an excellent assignment for yourself, to apply the 7 different steps of scenario planning to your current organization, and give yourself a limited amount of time per step. By going through that process, you'll get a feeling of how this process works, and then I would say go sit together, if you have the time, with a number of colleagues when you're really serious about implementing scenario planning. Sit together, organize a day and say, hey, how can we use scenario planning as a tool to imagine the future? To say, hey, if certain things will happen, we have these scenarios ready. And what you'll see after doing this exercise, that it on the one hand will sharpen you to look at the things that are happening in your external environment. And on the other hand, when certain things are happening, you can go back to the scenario planning, change the scenarios, adapt them. And if scenarios are really occurring, you have a set of action points ready to take and to engage in a much more strategic way of dealing with changes in terms of your workforce.